I'm gonna, let's see, yep, here it is. So it's called, the folder is called metropolitics underscore S20, and it has all these different files in it. Okay, so today we won't be working with all of them. We'll start with some of them. So first, let's look at this US Census Tracts shapefile. So if I open it up, you can see it has 5 different files in it, and these all make up one shapefile. And we'll see what that looks like when we open up our GIS software, but I want you to understand that all 5 of these make up one shapefile, and you have to make sure you always keep them together. Because otherwise it can't represent all the information that's needed. And these all contain different things. So for example, one of them contains the projection information, one of them contains the shape, and one of them contains the attribute. So all of these contain all the information that's needed to create one shapefile. So you have to make sure you have all of them, otherwise it won't be represented. Okay, so we'll be working with this US Census Tract shapefile. We'll also be working with this CSV called race and median income census data underscore 2018.csv. I'm going to open it up for you to look at it. So it has some information to represent the geographical area. So it has this thing called GeoFIPS, another way to identify it called GeoID, another thing called name, which says the census tract and then its number, and then there's another one called QName, which says the census tract and then where it is, so District of Columbia. So we'll be looking at the DC area today, so that's why this is DC, and if we were to scroll down, then we'll see one which is MD, which is for Maryland, and then we'll be looking at Virginia as well, so you'll see VA and Virginia. Okay, then you have a column that represents the state, which is, so you have a 2-digit code for DC, a 2-digit code for Maryland, and for Virginia, and then you have another thing which is the county number, and then you have a thing called GeoTract, which is the census tract number. And so these things together identify which census tract you're looking at. And then you have these other columns, so it says like SE underscore A 0001 underscore 001, and then you have these other ones. There's nothing in this file that tells you what these are, but if we go back to our folder, we have a file called census data underscore metadata.txt. Metadata is data about your data, and so that will usually, when you're downloading GIS data, this is pretty common to have these kinds of variables, these kind of like shortened or code versions representing your variables. And if you click on the metadata file, and these tend to look different. Sometimes it's a text file, sometimes it's a spreadsheet, but they're very common in that what you'll be able to find is the abbreviation or the code name and then what it represents. So in this case, for example, the A0001 represents total population, and then some of these other ones, it tells you this represents the white population, or this represents the Black or African American alone population. Okay, and then we have another one that stands for median household income. Okay, so we'll be using this later to know which variable that we will be representing. Okay. With our CSV, this race and median income one that I have open here, we also have this file that's a CSVT extension, and I'm going to open it up so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so this has the words integer and string in quotations, put one after the other. And this file, what it does is it tells QGIS, which we'll open up in a second, how to read your CSV and what are the types of the data that are here. So it says integer to tell it that this first column is an integer. Okay, let's go back to the file. And then it says string. A string represents text, so it's saying these 1, 2, 3, 4. These next 4 columns are strings, they're text. And even though this one right here looks like it has numbers in it, notice that it has the letters U and S inside of it. That's why anything that has even one letter in it can't be represented as a number, so it has to be text. So the next 4 are text, and then it's saying the rest of them are integers. And this is super important because you'll need to create this whenever you have a CSV that you want to use to represent information. In either maybe in the end of this workshop or in the next one, we'll be doing that. We'll be creating our CSVT file, but for this one I created it for you. And what you always do is you have the word integer or string in quotations and then a comma in between, no spaces, and then you just continue for the number of columns that you have in your CSV. There is also a type called real. That's when you have decimal values or you have numerical values that go beyond that are higher than a certain value. We won't worry about that today because we don't have any data forms that look like that. But in the future, we will need to worry about that. Okay, so let's close the CSVT. Let's close this CSV. Let me close this so that then I can open up I'll open up QGIS. Okay, so I'm going to search for QGIS. I have two of them just because I also have an older version, but you'll open up the one that you downloaded. Okay, so let's just give it a second to open up. Okay, and then we're going to click on Project up top and click New. And let me make this bigger so that it fills up the screen. Okay. So first, just to get a feel for how this works. So here you have the browser window. This lets you see the folders that you have, and also if you have any connections to online servers, and you can access your data on your computers in this way. Here you have the layers window, which shows you which layers are being represented in QGIS. And once we start adding layers, we'll see what that looks like. And this is your viewing window. This is where you will see whatever GIS data that whatever spatial data you've added, and you'll be able to see the different representations that you create. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll click on Layer in our toolbar at the top, and we'll click Add Layer, or we'll hover over Add Layer so that we can see these options, and then we are going to choose the option that says Add Delimited Text Layer. Okay, and here we'll click file name, and for me it's opening up in here. Yours might not. Just make sure you navigate to wherever the folder you've saved. So I'm going to actually find the folder that we're working in. I was working in a different folder beforehand. That's pretty much the same one. That's why it's called QGIS-DC. But I'll navigate to the one that we're using since it's called, to make sure that we're both on the same page, metropolitics_S20. And we'll click on our race and median income census data.csv. And then click open. Okay. So a few things you will want to do. For file format, it should have already checked off CSV, but if it doesn't, make sure you do that. Then for records and fields option, usually this will be done automatically, but you want to make sure this is checked off. First record has field names. You want it to know that it has a header, a labeling for all the columns, and then check off detect field types. That'll be done. It'll try detecting it. And if you have your CSVT file, this will be done properly. Okay, then in geometry definition, we're going to say no geometry, because this one, even though technically it has geometric information, the information is only represented in a table. It doesn't actually have any spatial information. The shape file is what actually has that. Okay, and then we'll just click add and click close. Nothing happens here because, as I said, it doesn't have any spatial information. It's just the CSV that we've loaded in to QGIS. We could look at the same data that we looked at before by right-clicking on our layer and then clicking on Open Attribute Table, and this will show us that same table that we were looking at before, right? But just in QGIS instead of in Excel, okay? And we can see all of our data is represented here. Okay, so I'm going to close this again. And now what we'll do is we'll add in the shape file, the US Census tracts, and we'll do that actually using the browser window instead of using the layer up top, just so you can kind of see that as well. Okay, so home, downloads. I have a lot of folders in my downloads folder, so it'll just take a second, and let's find Metropolitics. Okay, and now we're going to open up that US Census Tract shapefile folder, and you'll notice you actually only see one file, even though we had seen 5 before. That's because QGIS recognizes that all 5 of those are actually just one shapefile. And now you can drag that in. You could have also dragged in the CSV. The reason I didn't do it that way is because when you drag the CSV in, sometimes it doesn't read in what your CSVT is telling it, and it doesn't read in the right types, and it makes all of them text by default. We don't want that because later on we're going to be representing our numeric information, and we can't do that if it's represented as a text. Okay, so now here you see the US. It looks a little bit weird, one, just because it's not using the right projection, and then the other is because of trying to fit in Alaska and Hawaii. If you want to zoom in, what you can do is up top here, you have the zoom in icon, and if you click on that one, you can either click to zoom in, or you can draw a rectangle around the area that you want to zoom in. So I'm going to just draw a rectangle around the continental US, so excluding Alaska and Hawaii and the islands that make up the US and its territories, so like Puerto Rico, Guam, etc. for now are being excluded. Okay, let's zoom in a little bit more. Okay, and once you're done zooming in, I like to then make sure I click on the hand icon, and that just allows me to move it around, so I don't accidentally click on it and zoom. And you can see it takes a second and just re-renders whenever you move. That's totally fine. Don't worry about that. Okay, so the problem is that these two data sets are not connected. We want to connect them so that on our map we can represent some of the information that's coming from the census, such as the median income in the U.S. And actually, specifically, we just want to look at Virginia, D.C., and Maryland. Okay, but the thing is that data is in our spreadsheet, but this representation that we can see here is stored in this shapefile. So to combine those two together, we're going to do what's called a join. But to do a join, you need to have matching information on both of your files. So to give you an example, aside from this GIS files, because sometimes it can be confusing. So let's say the registrar has information on, has your name and your, let's say your grades, right? So they have your grades in their database, right? So that's one database. And then let's say there's a different, what's the right word? Different center on campus, and they have information on you. So they have your name and your address, right? And let's say now they have to send out your transcripts, or maybe let's say they have to send out some other information to you. So how would they combine those two databases, right? They have to make sure they find matching information. So how would they do that? So someone might suggest, okay, well, they could match on a first name, right? Okay, great, that's good, except a lot of people will probably share the same name. So you might run into a problem. So you could do something like first name and last name, right? Even then you might run into some conflicts. So then you might use something like uni, which each person has a unique identifier, since it's different for each person and it never repeats and it identifies a student, right? So in the same way that we use unis to identify students, now we want to figure out what uniquely identifies a census tract, and then see if both of these have a unique identifier, and also they have to have the same identifier so we can match on them. So because if one data set, let's say, going back to our Barnard example, or Barnard/Columbia, if one of the centers or one of the offices has your uni and other information, but then the other one just has, let's say, is trying to match things on first name, last name, and birth date, and then some other information, you can't do that, because if they don't have the uni, you can't match on the uni. You have to make sure that both offices or both databases have the same unique identifier. So we're going to try to see and figure out if these have the same identifier. We've already looked at what race and median income census data looks like. Now we're going to open up this tract file. And so this is the spatial information stored in this file. But if we right click, and again, if we click on open attribute table, we can see what's the attribute data that's associated with this spatial file. Okay. And since a lot of people tend to get this confused, a shape file is a file that has spatial data stored in it. So that's this census tracts file. The race and median income CSV is not a shape file. The tract is a shape file. Okay. So if we look here, we can see this also has a 2-letter state code. That's great. has a county code, but it's these two just on their own still are not that useful because they repeat, right? They're not unique. Each row doesn't have a different ID. Okay, then we have this GeoFIPS, which is the, usually FIPS is used to identify these things, and this is a census tract identifier, and it seems to look like it's different for each one. The only problem is you might see if you were to look later in your data set is that for another state, you can have the same tract identifier. So what you want is something that combines all of them together, which is this GeoID, which you can see is actually, and because once you start playing around with more spatial data, you'll realize this is how a lot of GeoIDs are created, which is usually a geo-identifier, a geographic identifier, as the kind of identifier that we're looking for. It starts usually with these IDs, the state ID, and then the county ID, and then whichever other one is added, in this case census tract. So you can see it starts with 60, and then 050, the county FP, and then 951203. Okay, then we have another one called name and QName, etc. So we could use something like QName, for example, since we know the other one had a name file. But again, as I said before, the census tract name can repeat. You could have another census tract in another state that has the same number, but its GeoID would still be different because then the state and the county ID would be different. So we want to see now, we'll go back to our race and median income and see if it has a column that has a data that looks similar to this. So we can see it's 11 digits. That's just the 2 plus the 3, 5 digits, and then another 6 digits, so 11 digits, and has starting with state ID, the county ID, and then the census tract ID. And we want to remember that this column is called GeoID in our tract file. And that was just loading for a second because since I clicked on this, it was trying to reorder this for lowest to highest. Okay, let's close this, and we're going to do open attribute table here. Okay, so let's look at this here. The only one that looks similar to that is this first column called geo_FIPS, because here the GeoID, even though it's called GeoID, actually has a lot as text inside US, which the other one didn't have, and it's actually much, much longer than the other GeoID column that we just looked at. Okay, but here this GeoFIP seems to look similar, and it starts with 51, and if we look here, actually, for Virginia, this is the state code, so it starts with 51, then it has the county code, 041. You'll see that this doesn't have the O, even though in here we do see the O before the 41. It's because this is represented, we made this represented as a number. If you remember when we were doing our CSVT file, because we had said this was an integer, and integers don't have leading zeros, but if this was represented as a text column, even if it would look like a number to us, it would be represented as text, and that's why you would see a 0, because the 0 would just be a character and not a number. Okay, and then we see we have, it looks like the digits for the census tract, and if we look here, we could see, yeah, so this is just a combination of state, county, and tract. That's here. So in our case, because these are states, Virginia, Maryland, and DC, and they all have a state ID code that doesn't start with the 0. So they have like 24, I think it's 51, and 11 or 16 maybe. I forgot what the third one is. We don't have any problems with this GeoFIPS, but I just wanted to point it out for 1 second that because this is represented as a number and not as text, if there was a leading 0, we would lose it, and that's a problem, and so that's why types are super important. So if I go back to our track layer and click open attribute table, and you look at this GeoID for this one, now that it's reordered, this first state, whichever one that is, its code is 01, and if this was if these two were represented as numbers, we would lose that leading 0, and then we wouldn't be able to match our data. In this case, because we're not working with any state that has a leading 0, we're not going to run into that problem, but that is something to be aware of. And so then if you were creating your CSVT file, you would make that first column in your CSV, this GeoFIPS, you would make it a string, a text column, instead of a number. Okay, so in race and median income, that column is called GeoFIPS. And then in our tract, it was called GeoID. And that's super important to remember because we'll be doing the match. And obviously, you can always click on the attribute table again to check. I'll remember them so that you don't have to do that. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we're going to right click on our shapefile. So remember, the shapefile is the one with the spatial information. That's this tract. And you can tell the difference because with the shapefile, you'll be able to see how it's represented. In this case, a pink square for polygons, since these are represented as pink squares. And then for anything that's not spatial data, and since it's a CSV, you see this little table. Okay, so we're going to click on our shapefile, right click, and click properties. And then here you have all these different options. We're going to click on the option that says joins. Then we're going to click on the plus icon so that would create a join. And the layer that we're going to join is this race and median income census data. Our join field is going to be the column in the CSV that we want to match on. So that was the one that was called GeoFIPS. Okay, and you can see next to the columns, you can see the type. So this one says 1, 2, 3 because it's a number, and these say ABC because these were the ones that we represented as strings. Okay, and then the target field is the name of the field in your shapefile, so in our tracks file. And in this one, remember that was called GeoID, not the one that was called GeoFIPS. So we're going to click on GeoID. Okay, then we're going to do one more thing, which is here we're going to click on the custom field name prefix. So what this does, when we do the join, what we'll see is that this race and median income data gets added to our census tract data. And when it gets added, it adds a prefix so that you always know where your data is coming from in front of the names of the columns. But we don't want such a long variable name because then that'll get super confusing. So we'll just delete this and I'll just leave it as C underscore so that we know it's coming from census data. Okay, and then click OK, and then click OK. Now, if you right click on your tract, on your shapefile and click Open Attribute Table, it always takes a second because we have so many. You can make this file smaller if you were to just extract out the DC shapefiles or something, for example. But in this case, it has all of them. That's why it's taking a while. Okay, and if you scroll to the right, you'll see that now it's added in these new columns. I didn't show you actually what it looked like before, so you have to sort of take my word on it, or if you're playing around with it again, if you end up happening to look at it before you do the join, you'll see that these columns don't exist before we do the join, but now you'll see they exist. So at first you might be like, oh, well, it looks like it didn't work though. Why are they all null? The reason they're all null is because this first state, whichever it is not in our CSV data set, right? So that's why these are all nulls. And if we were to scroll down, we'll see in between. So, whoops. For example, we'll see that there is some data here. Sorry. Okay, let me just scroll lower because then you'll actually see all the data. Okay, today is not... It's just scrolling too fast here. You can see that there is some data here from the states that we do have. Okay, so you'll see a lot of nulls, but don't assume that it didn't work because of that. Okay, so you might have to scroll to find it. Okay, so we're going to close this. Nothing happened to our map, though, when the join was happened because the join just combines the data together, but we haven't changed anything about the representation. So now what we're going to do is we're going to right-click and click on Properties. And make sure you right-click on your shapefile and click on Properties so that we can change its representation. We'll click on the word Symbology, which lets us change how things are represented. If we click on this drop-down at the top, right now it's single symbol, so everything looks the same. And we're going to choose Graduated, which is when you have the light to dark colors. Okay, for value, you tell it which column you want to use. So you can see now you have you only see columns that have type that is numbers. So you don't see any of our text columns because you can't represent text as graduated colors, right? Because there's no idea of a lower text than higher text. Technically, you might think of alphabetical as an order, but that is not how QGIS thinks about it, and so you don't have the option of using text. So let's represent median income for now. Okay, so to figure out which one is our median income, though, we'll have to go back to our metadata file. So if we open that up again, we can see, okay, where's median income? Median income is 14006,001. Okay, so we'll find that here, and here it is. We don't have a lot of data here, so it's not super confusing, but sometimes you do end up having a lot of data when you're working with census data, so you just want to be careful to make sure you're using the right one when you do that. Okay, so we'll click on that one, and then we're going to click on classify. And what that will do is it will take figure out what the lowest point value is in the data set, the highest value, and then create some graduated color scheme. Okay, so this starts at white, which you might not necessarily want, so you might want to change the lowest data point. And you can see that actually the lowest data point is probably 46, which is why it makes anything lower than 46 this white. Okay, so now if you click apply, you can see what it does. So let's actually just click OK so that this goes away so we can see what this actually looks like. Okay, let it load. And you'll see you see a very small amount of spatial information being represented here. That's because our CSV only had data for Virginia, Maryland, and DC, and so any place that doesn't have data for it just disappears, right? That's why you don't see anything else. Okay, so we'll just zoom into those areas. Nothing actually went wrong here. It's just the fact that you didn't have this in your CSV. If you did have more data in your CSV, all of it would be represented. Okay, so here we have, this is Maryland, this is Virginia, and then in the middle we have DC. To figure out which one is DC, if you did want to do that, I'm going to show you how you can select data just so you can figure it out. I know where it is, it's right here, but if you needed an idea, if you click on this arrow next to this icon here and click on select features by value, you'll be able to choose features based on the state that they're in. So remember we had like 51 and 24. So if I write in 51, right, and I click select features, you'll see that one state being selected. And I know that this one is Virginia, so I know that that's Virginia. And then I think the other one was maybe 24. And click select features, and you can see Maryland being selected, and then the other one was maybe it was 11. Nope. Yeah, it is 11, but you can't really see it because it's so small. We're actually gonna zoom in so you can see the highlight here, and there is DC. Right. So that's just to show you if you wanted to highlight it. You could also make this a different shape file itself. We're not gonna do that today. Okay, and then if you want to remove the highlighting, you click on this yellow square with the red icon next to it, and then that'll remove the highlighting. And you can also, again, zoom back out if you wanted to. Zooming out is the same way. You can click, or you can also draw a little rectangle, and then it'll zoom out a lot at once. Okay, I'm just going to let this amount fill up the screen, and actually maybe zoom in to a little bit more into DC. Okay. And remember, DC is here. Well, I should zoom in all the way, actually, for this first workshop. And for the next one, we'll maybe zoom out a little bit more. Okay? We have this data represented. It doesn't look that great, though. So let's make some changes to it. Okay, so we'll go back to our properties. Okay, so first things first is that we don't want really any white, because usually white sometimes will represent, I say usually and then I said sometimes, but the truth is that a lot of the times white represents data that you might not have, so you don't really want white to represent anything. So we really want its max value here to also be pretty much like 0 or 1, so that it doesn't represent anything in white, so that we change what gets put into this bin. But before we do that, I actually want to play around with these modes so that you can understand how this works. So I'm going to click on the histogram thing so you can actually see first what's happening. So if I click load values, here you see it has like a default way of dividing up the classes. So you can see there is data here and how much data fits into each category, right? You can move these categories around. If you were doing it manually, you can add them. We're not going to do that. We're going to go back to our classes. And here you can change the number of classes. So since I accidentally added one, I'm going to make this back into 5. And then this mode, initially what it does, equal count quantile, what that does we look back at our histogram, what that does is it takes your data set. So let's say in here there are a certain number of census tracts, and it makes sure that each class has the same number of census tracts within them. So that's why this class, for example, is really small versus this class is really big, because a lot of them fall within here. And you can see how many. So that's, for example, it's like 300 and then 250, so like maybe 750 or something. And then this will add up to around the same amount. That's why these are quantiles. Then this usually gives you a really nice distribution of colors, since each class has a good amount of census tracts or census tracts that fall within it. Then you have something called equal interval, and if I click apply, you can see how the colors change. Now a lot of them are much lighter. If we look at the histogram, what happens with that is that takes your lowest value, your highest value, and just equally spaces them apart. And now that's why you can see that a lot of the data falls in these two classes versus there's a lot less data in these, so you'll see a lot less of this color. And so usually you tend to see less variation, but it does give you nicer values. All right, so you want to be, there's pros and cons to each one. Then another really good one is natural breaks. And what that does is it tries to find a balance between the two. So it tries to find a balance between equal quantile and the equal intervals. Okay, so that's what we're going to use today. Generally, you also want to use around 5 to 6 classes because people usually can't tell the difference after you get more than that. And since actually what we'll do is make our, we'll make white not represent anything. We'll add a 6th class. And then we will make this one just go up to 1, okay, so that nothing falls in that category. Okay, and apply, and click OK, and you'll see now this is re-represented. Okay, so that's the first thing. Then let's also just change the color a little bit. You can do this manually or click on the drop down. You can also click on one of the color options and then choose one of those. So I'll choose blues, apply, and click OK. Okay. Yeah. So there you have it. Okay. So now you can see, and if I zoom out a little bit, actually, we can see how what the class distribution in this area looks like. There's really high median incomes in this area. Pretty low values here, and then a distribution kind of everything else around. Okay, so then you can kind of get an idea. Oops, I don't want to accidentally zoom out. Okay, let me go back to the hand. You can see what that distribution looks like in that area. And now what we'll do is we'll compare that to race and see what that looks like. So to be able to do that, we have to first create a copy of this file so that we can have both at the same time. Okay, so we're going to right click and click duplicate layer. Okay, so it'll create another one for you. Okay, we'll right click on the top layer and we'll click properties. And now instead of the value being this one, we'll change it. And the one we'll change it to is if we look at our, whoops, here it is, our metadata file again, the one that's Black or African American alone, which is 803001. Okay. A03001 and then _003. Okay, so let's click on that. And let's change the color so it's not the same exact color. Oops, I keep clicking on this. You're supposed to click on the drop down. And you can look at more color ramps if you click all color ramps and you'll see them. Let's just use the same color ramp for now. And then we'll change it later. Okay, and I'm going to click classify so that it creates a new class and doesn't use the ones that we had before. And again, we can look at our histogram and load values to see what that looks like. And again, this one, it looks like it's starting from a light blue instead of from a white, so maybe we'll leave it as it is and not change it for 0. Okay, and we'll click apply. And we can see what that looks like. And notice how this is almost, not exactly, but almost an inverse of what we were seeing before. And if we zoom in particularly to the DC area, remember before these were much darker, and this was the lighter area, so this was higher income, and these had lower median incomes. And now we're seeing that with race, this is where there is a much lower black population, and this is where there's a much higher black population. So there is one problem with this, though, that what we did so far is that we're looking at just the numbers, right? How many people, which is, I told you all before, that we don't want to do. We want to look not only at the number of people, but what percentage is that? So we're going to go back and right-click on our layer, and then we're going to click on Open Attribute Table, so that we can create a column in here that represents the percentage and not just the number, right? So what you want to do is you want to click on this pencil icon first on the left-hand side to toggle so you start editing. Then what we want to do is here, you have this new field icon, which is this table with a little yellow sign. And we're going to create a new column. So we're going to go P_black. Okay, so that's a percent black population. Okay, the type is not going to be an integer as we've had all these before, because if you have a percentage, you have decimal values. You have to go to decimal number real. Remember when I mentioned that there's real values when you have decimals, okay? And then click OK, and you'll see if you scroll, it might take a second. If you scroll to the right, there's a lot of columns and rows in this data set, so it's going to take a second. Okay, and you'll see it gets added. P_black is added here now. And now what we're going to do is we're going to click on this icon, which stands for Open Field Calculator. Okay. We're not going to click on create a new field. What we want to do is update an existing field. So the one that we want to do is this P_black. That's the one that we want to update. We want to put information into this one. And now we tell it, what does it equal? So what it equals is essentially our the column that we are working with, the black population. The one in our metadata file that we saw was for the black or African American alone population, and then we're going to divide it by the total population so that we have a percentage. Okay, so then we know in that area what percentage of the people are African American, not just how many. Okay, so we could search for that value here. So what let me just copy this, because I don't really want to write it out and I don't want to mess up the number of zeros. Okay, and then in fields and values, you should have this show up. What you could also do is, if you don't want to search for it, is if you scroll to the option that says field and values, then you'll be able to see all the different fields that are in here. Okay, and you'll see it show up here in quotations. You don't want to try to type this out because you might make a mistake, so that's why I always recommend clicking on it after you search for it, or else just without searching for it, just finding it here, so you don't make any mistake. Now what we're going to do is we're going to divide this, so that's just a slash. It gives you a little error just because we didn't put anything else here. So now we're going to look for the other one, and you see because it has the dots, it's a little bit hard to figure out what it is, and you know, if you try to make it bigger, even though you see the option, it doesn't help you. So now what we're going to do, I'm going to paste it, and then I'm actually just going to erase the last 3 and put in a 1, because if we go back to our metadata, we see that the 1 is the total population. Okay, so now I have this divided by this, and this will give you that value. Normally this output preview would show you what that value would be, but because here in this first row all of our values are null, null divided by null is just gonna be null. Okay, so click OK. This might take a second. Okay, and then it says task complete, so it should be complete. And I'm not actually gonna, yeah, okay, sorry. Anyways, it's here. There's still one problem with it though, is that right now it's represented as a decimal, which is why it has the 0.0 instead of as a percent because you have to multiply by 100. So we'll do that again. So we'll go back to our field calculator. We'll say update existing field, and we want to update our P black, and we're just gonna look for the same values here. And you can see here it says field and values. It also says recent field calculation, so you can put in your recent field calculation, and then at the beginning just write in 100 times. Okay, and you're not gonna put at the end because of order of operation. It's gonna apply the times 100 to the denominator, and you'll actually end up with the wrong value. You want to make sure you have it at the multiply to the numerator. Okay, and you could have done this the first time around. This is just to show you that this is a common mistake that might be made, and how you fix that. Okay. And again, it might take a second. Okay, now I'm not going to scroll down to actually show it. We'll see it when we visualize it. So let's close this. And now what we'll do is we'll right click and click properties. And instead of choosing that CAO3001, we'll scroll all the way down. Oh, sorry, we don't have to scroll all the way down. The reason we don't have to scroll all the way down actually, it's not, even though in our attribute table we have to scroll all the way to the right, is because whenever you choose a value here, it always shows you the ones from your shapefile first, and then the ones from your CSV. And since we created it in GIS, it gets added to our shapefile, so that's why you see this up here. Okay, so I'll click classify, let it classify the percentages. And you'll see now it goes from 0 to 100 instead of whatever values we were seeing before. Click apply. It might still look similar, but as you can see, there are some very important differences. This is a lot, looks a lot different than it used to before, because now we're seeing that percentage. And now what we'll do, I'm going to right click on this and click rename layer. Sorry, couldn't read probably for a second. So that we know what this is showing. We don't just want it to say tracked, etc., because that's what the other layer here says as well. So we want to make sure we know what this is representing. So I'm going to write %black. Okay, and then this one we'll rename and we'll call this median income. Okay. So we're not actually looking at both at the same time, right? You might be like, oh, I thought we were going to look at both at the same time, but we can only see one. And the reason is because in this viewer, you can only see, what's in that one location. And because these are both, technically, these layers are both the same place, you can't see both at the same time. You can only see one of them. If you wanted to look at a different one, so if we can uncheck %black, right? So we're not looking at this layer and then check off median income to look at that other layer, right? That's not very useful, is it? So now what we're going to do is we're going to go into the QGIS print composer, which allows us to create, that final PDF that we would create, and it also allows us to put different layers next to each other. One other thing I want to point out is this thing has that pencil icon. That's because we started, if you remember, if we go to our if I open the attribute table again, is that we had clicked on the pencil to start editing so that we could add a column to our data set, but at the end you want to click on the pencil again so that it stops editing and click save. And then you can close it. Now the pencil icon will disappear. Okay, give it a second. And I just want to say, I know that this might be a little bit hard to follow along in a video workshop. Usually this is done in person, and I stop quite often to take questions. So I know that this might not be the easiest thing, and if you have any questions, please, please, please feel free to reach out to me, to come to the office hours that I already mentioned before. And if any of those hours don't work for you and you need some other time, please email me, and I'd be happy to help you book an appointment with our fellows or meet with you myself. If that's possible. Okay, I hope this loads soon so that we can move on to the next part of our workshop.